Hey everyone, and welcome back to Digging Deeper. This is the third week in a series that we are breaking down Obadiah verse by verse. The last 2 weeks we've covered the first 9 verses of Obadiah, and today we're going to cover verses 10 through 14. So let's get started, starting in verse 10. For violence against your brother Jacob, shame shall cover you, and you shall be cut off forever. So there's this long-standing history of conflict between Jacob and Esau, which is what verse 10 starts off referring to, for violence against your brother Jacob, because they're essentially brother nations between Edom and the Israelites. So you got the Edomites descended from Esau, and then Jacob changed his name to Israel, which was the Israelites, where they descended from. So the violence against your brother Jacob. And I think it highlights and weighs on how the Edomites should have treated the Israelites, because it uses the term brother. It's not just a neighboring or an allied country, it's actually their family. And then shame shall cover you. So shame is that feeling of guilt and a consequence of sin. But the emphasis that it says shall cover you supposes that Edom, their shame, will affect their self-identity, because shame is that failing to live up to God's moral purpose. So I thought it was kind of neat how it used shame shall cover you. And then, and you shall be cut off forever. So the last part of that verse is a prophecy that the cities of Edom will fall into desolation, not to be inhabited again. And then verse 11. So to kind of set the tone of where the next 4 verses go, is there some key historical pieces that I'm going to share with you guys that play into the next 4 verses. So it was 587 BC, the Babylonian Empire, led by King Nebuchadnezzar, invaded and sacked Jerusalem. And this is the 3rd time that they have done that. So that kind of is the historical context of where we're at. But so now we'll read in verse 11. In the day that you stood on the other side, in the day that strangers carried captive his forces, when foreigners entered his gates and cast lots for Jerusalem, even you were as one of them. So in the day that you stood on the other side, Edom stood idly by as the Babylonian Empire attacked Jerusalem. They stood aloof, one of the translation uses, which means, I looked up the definition of aloof, it means cool in distance. So they were kind of calm-mannered about the attack on Jerusalem, and they stood away at a distance. In the day that strangers carried captive his forces, when foreigners entered his gates. So this is the accounts of the invaders that broke into Jerusalem. They broke down the walls, they burnt down houses, and they even burnt down the house of the Lord. And then they ran off with treasures. They looted the cities. And cast lots for Jerusalem, even you were as one of them. So I had to look up what casting lots meant to get some clarification. And it was commonly done to divide land. And here, it was like flipping a coin. So they were flipping a coin and dispersing land is how they commonly did it. And here it was probably done the same, because they had just conquered the city of Jerusalem, and then they were pillaging and looting. So they were probably using this casting of lots to divide land, to divide treasures and everything else. And then even you were as one of them. So even though Edom never directly involved themselves in that primary attack, it still says that they were just as bad as the ones that did. So moving on to verse 12. So these next 3 verses I'm going to read through and through, and then we're kind of going to work backwards, because of the way that the events happen. Is it's easier to see them as we go backwards, is because of the timeline that it follows. And then I also want you guys to pay attention to the different verbiage that is used, because there is 7 or 8 times where it uses these "you should not have" or "nor should you have." there's these anti-statements of you should not have. So I want you to pay attention and pick those out as we read through them as well. But I'm going to read 12, 13, and 14, and then we're going to kind of work our way backwards. Starting in verse 12. But you should not have gazed on the day of your brother, in the day of his captivity, nor should you have rejoiced over the children of Judah in the day of their destruction, nor should you have spoken proudly in the day of distress. You should not have entered the gate of my people in the day of their calamity. Indeed, you should not have gazed on their affliction in the day of their calamity, nor laid hands on their substance in the day of their calamity. You should not have stood at the crossroads to cut off those among them who escaped, nor should you have delivered up those among them who remained in the day of distress. So in verse 14, we're going to work backwards here. It says, you should not have stood at the crossroads to cut off those among them who escaped. So you had these refugees that escaped Jerusalem after the attack from the Babylonians. And what the Edomites actually did is they knew exactly where they were going to go on their escape route, and they waited. And as soon as the Israelites came to that crossroads, they actually captured them and brought them back to the city. So they waited and captured and returned them. And then it says those 2 points where it says you should not have and then nor should you have. So they did those things that they shouldn't have done. And then going back to verse 13, is it talks about how, just a moment. So there's 3 instances where it says in the day of their calamity. So this highlights how dire of a situation that this was for Israel. Like they have just been attacked by the Babylonian Empire. And not only, like in the kind of midway down in that verse, should not have gazed on their affliction. So they shouldn't have, the Edomites mocked Israel. And now we find out that they were actively participating in their misery because they waited at that crossroads in verse 14, and now they've took them back and they were mocking them along the way. And then it says, nor laid hands on their substance in the day of their calamity. So not only did they capture them, mock them, and bring them back to the city, but at that point, King Nebuchadnezzar allowed them, in return for bringing those refugees back, he allowed them to loot what was left in the city. So going back to the first week where we talked about if thieves have come to you, if robbers by night, oh, how you will be cut off. Would they not have stolen till they had enough? It's this idea that they should have left something, but they didn't. They were going back and they were taking more of what they did not need. And then jumping back to verse 12, it says that, but you should not have gazed on the day of your brother in the day of his captivity. So they're told that they should not have gazed or gloated over their brother, which was Jacob and the Israelites, in the day of his captivity, which relates to the being exiled in distant lands. And then one version or translation says became a stranger. So instead of day of his captivity, he became a stranger. So not only did they help, but they stood by and laughed at Israel for being invaded. And then they mocked and boasted in their distress. So you can kind of see when it goes from 14 to 13 to 12 that they returned these refugees back. Then they were allowed to loot, and then they mocked them even further than they already did. So that kind of ends where we're going to stop for today. In verse 14, we'll pick up and continue reading next time, and we'll continue diving in and breaking down each verse moving forward. So thanks, guys.